The lights in the hearing room were unforgiving, bright enough to show every raised eyebrow, every twitch of a jaw. Representative Jasmine Crockett sat poised, hands folded over a slim binder marked with yellow tabs. Across the table, former Vice President Mike Pence adjusted his tie, that familiar calm smile fixed in place. The agenda was supposed to be about federal community grants, but everyone knew it had swerved into something else the moment Pence opened his mouth. Representative Crockett, he began in that practiced, pastoral tone, when I talk about policy, I talk about values, faith, family, and responsibility. Without those, no amount of government spending will fix what's broken in our communities. The words dripped with confidence, crafted to sound unimpeachable. The cameras caught the subtle nods from a few of his allies behind him. Crockett's eyes didn't narrow, but her stillness was sharper than a glare. She let the silence sit for half a beat before speaking. "Mr. Pence," she said evenly, "faith without action is just words, and words without accountability don't feed a single child or keep a single roof from collapsing." The room shifted. Pence smiled politely, but it didn't quite reach his eyes. "Faith inspires action," he countered. "But it starts in the heart, not in Washington." "That's the thing," Crockett replied, leaning forward just slightly. "For the families in my district, action starts with whether the heat turns on in January, whether the water's clean, whether the hospital down the road is still open next month. Faith might carry you through the night, but it won't pay the rent come morning." Murmurs rippled through the back row. The exchange had taken less than 2 minutes, but already, the battle lines were clear: Pence's moral high ground versus Crockett's lived reality. The microphones captured every word, but it was the unspoken challenge in her voice that told the real story. This wasn't going to be another polite, forgettable policy debate. Pence clasped his hands in front of him, the kind of gesture meant to project patience. "Representative, I appreciate your passion, but I think we both know that a nation can't legislate its way into virtue. Faith is the foundation. Without it, we're just pouring money into broken systems." Crockett tilted her head slightly, like she was weighing the words. "You talk about virtue, Mr. Pence, but virtue without justice is just comfort for the powerful. You can stand on faith all day long, but if you're standing on the backs of people who can't breathe under the weight of bad policy, that's not virtue, it's neglect dressed as morality." A low murmur swept the audience seating. A reporter near the aisle scribbled the phrase "neglect dressed as morality" in big letters. Pence's smile faltered for half a second before returning. "You know, Representative, I was raised to believe that faith and charity begin at home. Neighbors helping neighbors, churches stepping in where government can't. I'm not sure Washington is the answer to everything." Crockett leaned in now, her binder unopened, her voice steady but gaining edge. "I was raised to believe faith was supposed to be the hands that rebuild after the storm, not the excuse for leaving the roof half-fixed. And as for churches stepping in, I love them, but I've yet to see a Sunday sermon fill every fridge on a block where parents work 60 hours a week and still come up short." The air in the room seemed to thicken. Pence adjusted his cufflinks, a practiced motion, but his eyes flicked toward the cameras. He could feel the framing slip away. Somewhere in the back, a young staffer mouthed to another, "She's not playing tonight." Pence cleared his throat, shifting slightly in his chair. "Representative Crockett, with all due respect, I think you underestimate the role of personal responsibility. Government programs can't replace the discipline, the moral compass, and yes, the faith, that keeps a society strong. Without those, no amount of federal aid will change the outcomes you're talking about." Crockett's eyebrows lifted, just slightly. "Personal responsibility," she echoed, her tone razor-sharp without being loud. "Mr. Pence, I represent neighborhoods where personal responsibility means walking to 2 jobs before sunrise, where parents take on debt they'll never escape just to keep their kids in school. Don't talk to me about responsibility as if poverty is a symptom of moral failure." A few people in the audience actually murmured yes under their breath. Pence tried to speak, but she kept going. "You know what really underestimates personal responsibility," she said, leaning forward now. "It's when leaders point fingers at struggling families instead of asking why the water's poisoned, why the rent's impossible, and why wages haven't kept up with the price of bread since before I could vote. Pence's jaw tightened, but Crockett didn't stop. Faith talk is fine, but if your faith can't face those questions, if it can't stand in the same room as hard truth, then it's not the people's faith you're defending. It's just a shield for power. The words landed heavy. Even the court stenographer hesitated for a split second before catching up. The camera zoomed tighter on Pence, but it was Crockett's calm, unwavering expression that dominated the shot. Pence leaned back slightly, crossing his arms, not defensively, but in that, I've heard it all before, way politicians perfect over decades. Representative, I believe in compassion, but I also believe there's a limit to what government should do. Faith teaches us to lift people up without making them dependent. Sometimes, hard truth is that you can't save everyone. Crockett didn't blink. You're right about one thing, Mr. Pence, faith does teach us to lift people up. But it doesn't say, only if it's convenient, and it sure doesn't say, only if they can pay you back. She sat forward now, elbows resting lightly on the table, her voice dropping just enough to pull the room in. You talk about dependency like it's a sin. I talk about abandonment like it's not an option. Because when you tell a working mom she's on her own after the factory closes, when you tell a sick veteran he just has to find a way, that's not faith, that's washing your hands while calling it virtue. There it was, Pence's smile vanished. His lips pressed into a thin line. And since you're talking about saving everyone, she continued, let's be honest, it's not that we can't, it's that some folks in power decide who's worth saving and who isn't. That's not a budget issue, Mr. Pence, that's a values issue. And no Sunday sermon can excuse that choice. The audience gave a soft, collective exhale. This was the moment, the kind of cut that would end up clipped, captioned, and shared 1,000,000 times before morning. Pence straightened his tie, but the damage was already hanging in the air. Pence tried to regain his footing, leaning toward the mic with that deliberate, measured tone he'd used in countless debates. Representative Crockett, my faith isn't about choosing who's worth saving, it's about encouraging every American to rise above their circumstances. Government can help, yes, but at the end of the day, it's faith and determination that change lives. Crockett's gaze locked on him, unblinking. Faith and determination can move mountains, Mr. Pence, but you can't climb one without a foothold. And that foothold? That's housing. That's healthcare. That's a wage you can actually live on. If government can't provide that, then all you're doing is preaching from the top while folks are still stuck at the bottom. She let the sentence hang, then continued, her tone like a slow tightening of a vice. You talk about rising above circumstances, but what happens when those circumstances are built into the system? When the deck is stacked so high that faith alone isn't enough to see daylight? Pence opened his mouth, but Crockett cut in with the precision of a prosecutor. I don't question the sincerity of your faith, Mr. Pence. I question the sincerity of policies that preach grace on Sunday and pull the ladder up on Monday. A ripple of quiet applause broke out in the back, quickly hushed by staffers. Cameras shifted to catch Pence's reaction, but he only pressed his lips together and adjusted his notes. Crockett, though, sat back with the confidence of someone who knew the point had already landed, because it wasn't just a counterargument. It was a mirror. Crockett's voice softened, but the steel stayed underneath. You know, Mr. Pence, I didn't grow up thinking Washington was the answer to everything either. My mother worked 6 days a week, cleaned houses in the mornings, stocked shelves at night. She didn't need the government to teach her work ethic. She needed the government to make sure her paycheck didn't run out before the groceries did. The room stilled. Even the hum of the cameras seemed quieter. She used to tell me, Crockett continued, faith is good, baby, but faith doesn't fix a leaking roof. That's a hammer and a paycheck. And I remember thinking, if that's true for our roof, it's true for our country. Pence shifted slightly, adjusting his pen in his hand. My mom didn't pray for handouts, Crockett said, her eyes fixed on him. She prayed for a fair shot. For the bus to come on time so she could get to her second job. For her kids not to get sick from mold in the walls. That's not dependency, that's dignity. A few heads in the audience nodded slowly. The tension had shifted, it wasn't just political anymore, it was personal. And that's why I get frustrated when people in positions of power, she added, use faith as a shield from accountability. Because faith isn't an excuse to do less, it's the reason to do more. Her words landed like a slow, deliberate drumbeat. Pence didn't interrupt. He just tapped the tip of his pen against his notes once, twice, like he was buying himself time. Crockett straightened in her chair, shifting from memory to momentum. And here's the part we don't like to say out loud, Mr. Pence, faith talk sounds noble, but too often it's a substitute for real solutions. When you vote against expanding healthcare, when you oppose increasing the minimum wage, when you block housing initiatives, then you stand up and say, faith will see us through. That's not leadership. That's deflection. A faint stir rippled through the room, the kind of shift that happens when people realize the gloves have come off. You can't tell a diabetic veteran faith will cover the cost of insulin, she pressed on. You can't tell a single mom faith will keep the lights on when the power company cuts her off. And you cannot, her voice dipped here, slow and deliberate, tell the American people that their suffering is somehow a test of character while you vote against the very tools that could end it. Pence leaned toward his mic, but Crockett's voice overrode his movement, measured and unwavering. I know you believe what you're saying, Mr. Pence. But belief without action is just decoration. And I'm not here to decorate speeches, I'm here to make sure the folks who sent me here get more than words. Someone in the press row mouthed, that's the clip. The line had the sharpness of something destined for headlines. Pence's fingers interlaced tightly on the table. For the first time that evening, his expression didn't read practiced, it read cornered. Pence took a slow breath, his voice steady but quieter now. Representative, I think you're misunderstanding my point. I'm not dismissing need, I'm saying that at the heart of our solutions must be the moral strength of our people. Government can only go so far. Crockett leaned in, eyes locked. No, Mr. Pence, I understand your point perfectly. You want moral strength without moral responsibility. You want faith to do the heavy lifting so policy doesn't have to. But here's the truth, faith without justice is just a sermon. And sermons don't rebuild flooded towns, they don't reopen closed hospitals, and they sure don't put food on a bare table. She opened her binder for the first time, sliding a single page forward so the cameras could catch it. This is a federal report from last year. It shows that states with the highest poverty rates are also the ones cutting social programs in the name of self-reliance. That's not faith, it's abandonment dressed up in scripture. A few gasps came from the audience. Pence glanced at the page but didn't touch it. Crockett's voice stayed calm, but her words hit like stone. When faith is used as a reason not to act, it's not faith anymore, it's a cover. And the people who pay the price aren't in this room. They're the ones shivering in their kitchens in January, praying for the heat to kick in, wondering why their leaders talk about lifting people up while leaving them on the floor. The silence afterward wasn't awkward, it was heavy. The kind that sticks to every wall in the room. Crockett closed her binder and rested both hands on the table. Let me tell you something, Mr. Pence. I was 13 when my family got evicted. My mother worked harder than most people in this building, and it still wasn't enough to keep a roof over our heads. We slept on couches, in borrowed rooms, and every night my mom told me, don't you dare let them make you feel ashamed for surviving. Her voice stayed even, but there was no mistaking the weight behind it. That's why I bristle when leaders use faith as a way to moralize poverty, because I've lived it. And I can tell you, poverty doesn't care how much scripture you can quote. Poverty is a broken heater in February. Poverty is wondering if the next knock at the door is another eviction notice. Pence's eyes flickered, not in defiance, but in recognition. Crockett leaned closer, the room utterly still. Faith is not the enemy here. But when you put faith above action, you're telling people like my mom, people like I was, that they just didn't pray hard enough. That's not leadership, it's cruelty wrapped in Sunday language. Someone in the press row typed the words cruelty wrapped in Sunday language in all caps. A few staffers exchanged glances. They knew this was the line people would remember. Crockett sat back, calm but unshakable. If faith is real, it shows up with its sleeves rolled up, ready to work. If it's just words, then it's not faith, it's theater. And America doesn't need more theater. Crockett let the silence linger, the weight of her words still hanging in the air. Then she spoke again, calm, precise, and impossible to look away from. Mr. Pence, you said earlier that you can't save everyone. I'll give you my 5-word reply, then step aside for someone who will. The room froze. Not a shuffle, not a cough. Even the cameras seemed to pause. Pence's expression tightened, but he didn't respond, not because he didn't have the vocabulary, but because there was no answer that wouldn't sound hollow after that line. She continued, her voice cutting clean through the heavy quiet. This isn't about left or right. It's about whether we believe that every American, every single one, is worth the effort. If you can't stand in that belief, if you can't fight for it, then you don't belong in the fight at all. A slow ripple of applause began at the back, hesitant at first, then louder, until even some of the staffers couldn't help but join in. Crockett didn't smile. She didn't pump her fist or look to the cameras for approval. She simply gathered her papers, nodded to the chairwoman, and stood. Because for her, this wasn't a performance. It was a promise, and she intended to keep it. By the time the clip hit social media, those 5 words were already trending. On TikTok, they flashed in bold over her face, then step aside for someone who will. On Twitter, the hashtag #StepAside was joined by thousands of comments, some cheering, some furious, but none indifferent. And somewhere, in more living rooms and kitchens than anyone in that chamber would ever know, people nodded quietly to themselves, thinking, finally, someone said it. Mike Pence tried to steer the debate onto the familiar ground of faith and personal responsibility, but Jasmine Crockett shifted the entire dynamic by grounding her arguments in both hard data and deeply personal experience. Throughout the exchange, she never raised her voice, yet every word carried weight, tightening the air in the room. Her 5-word finale, then step aside for someone who will, left Pence and millions watching in complete silence. This wasn't just a political sparring match, it was a moment that separated those who are truly willing to fight from those who only talk about it. Crockett's message was crystal clear: faith only means something when it's matched with action, and those unwilling to act should make way for those who will.